Did you know that Daniel was 80 years old when he was thrown into the lion's den? Can you believe he spent 6 days there yet came out without a scratch? How did he do that, and what did he do to end up there? In this video, you will learn about the story of Daniel and the lion's den, along with all the deep meanings it holds. The story of Daniel begins in the 6th century BCE, during a tumultuous period in the history of the ancient Near East. Daniel was a young noble of Judah, born into a prominent Jewish family. His life took a dramatic turn when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon besieged Jerusalem in 605 BCE and carried many of its inhabitants into exile. Daniel was most likely in his teenage years when the exile to Babylon happened. Although he was a captive, there was certainly something exceptional about him. The Bible says that King Nebuchadnezzar ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. This is how we know Daniel was royalty back in Judah. The young men were to be without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Ashpenaz was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from his table so that they would be well-fed, unlike the rest of the captives. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen was Daniel. He was selected along with other young men for his intellect, wisdom, and noble lineage. This was how Daniel entered the service of the Babylonian government. There is a need for us to flip back to the book of Isaiah because, at this point, one of Isaiah's prophecies had just been fulfilled. Daniel was born during the reign of King Josiah, a time when the nation of Judah was experiencing spiritual revival. But shortly after Josiah's death, the nation slid into rebellion. God's judgment and discipline were inevitable. More than 100 years earlier, the prophet Isaiah had given this warning. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house, and what your fathers have accumulated until this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, fulfilled Isaiah's prophecy when he deported Jerusalem's best and brightest youths as slaves, and Daniel was one of them. The Bible doesn't tell much about Daniel's family. We don't know if they were aware of Isaiah's prophecy or if they recognized its fulfillment. It's hard to imagine the emotions that must have swept over them when he was taken away. How would you have felt? Did you know that Nebuchadnezzar was also trying to send a message by taking away all the items of worship? The confiscation of these items and their deposit in a Babylonian temple was a dramatic declaration by Nebuchadnezzar, saying, "My God is better than your God." Now the God of Israel had to vindicate himself. Daniel, along with his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were later given Babylonian names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, underwent 3 years of rigorous training. You would expect absolute compliance from someone who was a captive but had now been drafted into the king's service. However, Daniel was different. He made a resolution not to eat the food that was assigned to the king's elect. The Bible says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. If you were King Nebuchadnezzar, what would you do to this captive who turned down your benevolence? The food being offered was of the best quality, not only fit for a king but literally eaten by a king. They might very well have been executed for their refusal of the direct order of the king. Why, then, did Daniel take this stand? There are several possibilities. First, some of the food may have been forbidden according to Leviticus 11. The Jewish law forbids the eating of certain animals, and some of the food commonly eaten in Babylon would violate Jewish food taboos. Daniel also refused the wine of the king. Although wine is never forbidden as unclean in the law, it is possible the wine had been offered to the gods of Babylon or that Daniel had taken a Nazirite vow. A second explanation is that Jewish law forbids the eating of meat sacrificed to false gods. This is true later in history, and it makes sense for Daniel. Eating meat sacrificed to idols is always a problem for Jews living in the diaspora and is a serious controversy in some of Apostle Paul's churches. But there is not much evidence it was a problem in the Old Testament. Third, A better explanation is that Daniel understood eating the king's food represented accepting the king's friendship and patronage. To share food is to commit oneself to a relationship. King Jehoiakim accepted the king's food, implying his loyalty to Babylon. In fact, Daniel 11 verse 26 warns against everyone who eats from the rich food of the king who is to come. Daniel did not refuse the training of the king or the use of a new name, but he drew the line at eating the king's food because it was a public declaration of dependency on the king. Daniel did not rely on Nebuchadnezzar but only on the Lord. Daniel, therefore, resolved himself not to eat this food. He literally set his heart not to eat the food. Daniel understood the situation and decided in his heart what was right and what was wrong, and chose to do the right thing. Once set, Daniel would not be moved. His plan was to eat only vegetables and water so he would not defile himself. He was going to feed on herbs and food grown from seeds. Whatever the king's meal was, Daniel and his friends chose not to eat it. The chief in charge of the king's elect did not think this was a wise idea since he was certain that without the king's food, the four would be weaker than the rest, and then he would get into trouble. He said, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard the chief official had appointed, "Please test us for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat us in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel specifically could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Daniel and his friends had been set apart by God. Eventually, Daniel served under 4 different kings. When King Nebuchadnezzar died, his son Belshazzar became king. He was followed by kings Darius and Cyrus. We are told that Daniel remained in Babylon through the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. You may wonder why the king decided to choose captives to train and enlist into his government. Why did he change their names, give them different food, and treat them like royalty? What if those captives eventually turned on him and overthrew him, taking down the entire Babylon from the inside out? The purpose of the food, names, and education was simple. This was an effort at total indoctrination with the goal of making these young Jewish men leave behind their Hebrew God and culture. Undoubtedly, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to communicate to these young men, "Look to me for everything." Daniel and his friends refused, insisting that they would look to God. Most of the Jewish captives, like the prophet Ezekiel, ended up in refugee settlements and worked as slave laborers. Only a select few received white-collar jobs in the king's palace. The qualities that drew King Nebuchadnezzar's attention to Daniel and his friends were that they were children of Israel, some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles. They were young men without blemish, good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, with the ability to serve in the king's palace and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. This was an attack on the future of Israel, such that if they were to be freed from captivity at any time, those who were supposed to take the reins of their government and rebuild their own nation would have been indoctrinated and committed to Babylon instead. Daniel didn't fall for this, however. He pressed on. He was different. He was special. He did everything right and was a favorite in the king's court. So why did King Darius have him thrown into the lion's den? What offense could Daniel have committed? The story is quite interesting. By the time Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, he was already over 80 years old. He was an elderly man. He was no longer the young, handsome noble who refused the king's food. Daniel is most famous for being thrown into the lion's den. What many people don't know is why this incident happened or how it began. There are several reasons Daniel found himself in the lion's den. He was not put there because he obeyed the king's command. It was quite the opposite. Under King Darius, Daniel was promoted to high office, which aroused the jealousy and envy of other high officials who plotted to bring him down. Darius divided his kingdom into 120 satrapies, or provinces, over each of which he placed a governor or a satrap. Over the 120 satraps, he placed 3 governors, one of whom was Daniel. These satraps were accountable to the governors so that the king would not suffer loss. Daniel showed integrity and wisdom above all the other leaders, so the king decided to promote him and set him over the whole realm. Because of Daniel's high position, the other officials were envious. They made a conspiracy to get rid of him. They sought to find some fault in him, but they couldn't because Daniel was a faithful worker. They couldn't find any fault in him, so they thought of a way to accuse him through the law of his God. The conspiracy was born out of jealousy and envy, and the conspirators set a trap for Daniel. They were unable to find any fault in Daniel's work ethic, character, or personal life, so they devised a plot that forced Daniel to choose between his loyalty to the law of the Medes and Persians and his loyalty to the law of his God. The conspirators knew that Daniel prayed regularly to his God, so they convinced King Darius to issue a decree forbidding anyone from praying to any god or man for 30 days, except to the king himself. Anyone who disobeyed would be thrown into the lion's den. Now, it is important to know that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, a decree signed by the king was irrevocable and could not be repealed. The conspirators knew Daniel's faithfulness to his God would not allow him to comply with the decree. They were right. Despite the decree, Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day, just as he had always done. He went to his upper room, opened the windows facing Jerusalem, knelt down and prayed. The conspirators caught Daniel in the act and immediately reported it to the king. When Darius heard the news, he was deeply distressed. He valued Daniel and tried to find a way to rescue him, but the law was clear. The king had no choice but to order Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. Before doing so, Darius expressed his hope that Daniel's God would deliver him. The lion's den was a pit where lions were kept, and it was used as a form of execution. The den was sealed with a stone, and the king's seal was placed on it so that no one could rescue Daniel. King Darius spent the night fasting and refused any entertainment. At dawn, he hurried to the lion's den and called out to Daniel. To his amazement, Daniel responded. He said, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you." Daniel's deliverance was a miracle. God protected him, and he emerged unscathed. King Darius was overjoyed and ordered Daniel to be lifted from the den. No wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. King Darius then commanded that the men who had falsely accused Daniel, along with their families, be thrown into the lion's den. The lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Following this event, King Darius issued a decree that in every part of his kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. He acknowledged God's sovereignty and declared that God's kingdom would never be destroyed and his dominion would endure forever. The story of Daniel in the lion's den teaches us several valuable lessons. It highlights the importance of unwavering faith and trust in God, even in the face of persecution and danger. Daniel's example of steadfastness in prayer and obedience to God is a powerful testament to the strength of faith. It also shows how God can deliver his faithful servants from seemingly impossible situations. Daniel's story is a reminder that God is in control, and he can protect and vindicate those who trust in him. Lastly, it underscores the idea that God's justice prevails. The conspirators who plotted against Daniel were ultimately punished, and the king recognized the power and sovereignty of God. Daniel's journey from a young noble of Judah to a high-ranking official in the Babylonian and Persian empires is a remarkable story of faith, integrity, and divine intervention. His experiences, including his refusal to defile himself with the king's food and his miraculous deliverance from the lion's den, serve as enduring examples of unwavering faith and trust in God. Daniel's story continues to inspire and teach us about the importance of faithfulness, integrity, and the power of prayer.